Well, I started my woodworking a long, long time ago, probably about 1972 or 3, I think. Had a jigsaw and a router and a chisel, one hand plane, and a handsaw, and I built just about everything I do today with those tools. So the router was like my baby. I believe I could have written one of the router books, but never did. But anyway, as I got into turning, and started doing some more decorating on things, I kind of started adding the router to it to see what you could do with it, particularly since I was real fascinated by the guys doing the ornamental turning, and I knew there wasn't any way I could buy a $10,000 lathe and $100,000 worth of tools and all that. So I thought, well, let's figure out what we can do with the router. But one of the things I wanted to show you tonight before we get started on it, well, I'll show you some of these real quick. I turn a lot of miniatures. I actually got in a contest a couple of years ago, and I forgot to bring those to see who could turn the world's smallest goblet. And the smallest one I turned was 23 thousandths of an inch, about as tall as 4 pages of paper. A guy from Canada turned one smaller, but his hobby is building 1/44 scale scenes. So when we found out that the Guinness Book of World Records wasn't interested in them, I quit. Said, you can win. I'm not going to keep battling on it. I actually forgot I had this. It was sticking inside this box over there. This was, I make mock-ups a lot of times. I made this table for my sister last year for Christmas. And so I made a miniature mock-up first to see how it would work. And of course, you get to play with some really nice grain when you do that. Little tiny pieces. A lot of fun. We're going to talk about a lot of different ways to use the router, but I just want to give you some really rough examples. Back there. Probably the earliest examples I did was back when I was building furnitures, what they call split turning. You know, in this case, I glued a blank in between there, turned these. After I finished turning them, I ran the router through them to give me flutes, and I'll explain how in a few minutes. And it was glued together with a paper joint. So you just drive a knife down through there, it pops right apart, and now you can glue these on your furniture and have quarter turnings, half turnings, whatever you want to do on them. I've done a lot of furniture pieces or replacement pieces for people all the time, and so that's kind of how you do that, but we'll talk more about how you do that in a few minutes. What I wanted to start everything with is it's real important, I think, to get really good clean cuts with your tools if you're going to go back to doing all this surface decoration, carving, routing, because if you get a lot of detail in your pieces like this, and you have to go back and do very much sanding, now you ruined all the details that you added. So you want to kind of get cut as cleanly as possible first so that you can sand very lightly. Then when you go back with the router, you only touch it up with 220 or 320, 400, and you don't have to do quite as much work on it. So the first thing I'm going to talk about real briefly is just cutting a little bit cleaner than normal. And of course, the very first thing is sharpening. What I do, one of the techniques that saved me a lot of hassle, of course, a lot of people are using the Wolverine jigs now, which I think are excellent. You can build your own. You know, of course, David Ellsworth sells his jig, and a lot of other companies sell something similar. But it allows you to repeat. You got it? Yeah, there you go. Allows you to repeat cuts very easily. The problem is on these wheels, if you're not using one of the current CBN wheels or you're not using the Sorby sanding system or something like that, your wheels wear down. So I built these little, which camera is that? Okay. I built these little things. If you buy the Raptors, I don't know how much they are, it's made out of steel. Started making these after reading Mike Darlow's book years ago. And all you do is you lay it against the wheel and you draw, you know, once you've established how far out your V-arm should be for that particular gouge or skew, whatever, you lay it against the wheel and you draw an arc. And then you come see him and you take your scroll saw and you cut out part of the arc. And what you have left is these two little pins, and you lay it on there. And what I actually do is I kind of burnish it. Move that in until they make contact. Lock it down. And I turn the grinder on and actually burnish these so that you know positively it's making contact at 3 points. Now I labeled them, originally I made one for bowl gouges, spindle gouges, detail gouges, the whole 9 yards. And that worked really well. But I found that when I'm doing production work in the shop, I don't want to waste time moving this arm all the time and pulling out the right jig. So what I started doing, and I hope I put them in here, is making a V-block that drops down in there. Now what that allows me to do is take my spindle gouge, in this case it's a Thompson detail gouge, and of course you got to set your tool at the same distance all the time. It doesn't really matter how far it is as long as it's the same every time. And now what I do is I set that. Now originally what I did was I carved a notch in here. I figured out my bowl gouge is sharpened at 55 degrees. I like these sharpened at about 35 degrees. So what I was doing was I carved that down until my 35 degree bevel would set flush on there with the V-arm set at the bowl gouge setting. So now when I want to change, when I'm working during the day, my V-arm never changes. I just put a different V-block in there real quick, depending on whether it's my spindle gouge or this gouge, or I've got other gouges sharpened at different angles. And so that allows me to go back and sharpen those tools very quickly without doing anything. Now also, a lot of my tools have 2 and 3 bevels. The bevels all below the main bevel don't do anything. They just get metal out of the way. A tip on sharpening bowl gouges. See if we can zoom in on that a little bit. There you go. All right. That's not, well, it'd get focused if it's on my hand probably. Okay, there we go. A tip on sharpening these is this bottom edge. If you sharpen on a concave wheel like we're doing right now, and all you've got is this front edge is sharp, if you look at my hand, you got this sharp and that sharp. So when you're going down through the bottom of a bowl, this sharp corner will actually bruise the wood if you stop at all. And you can sand it out, but then when you put finish on it, it comes back. It just, because it's bruised the wood, it never takes the finish the same way. So if you knock that corner off, then that doesn't happen. So I got into a habit over years of, after I pull it out of the tools, I just kind of run it on there and grind away that corner. And but then I decided somewhere along the line, I started working with a shorter main bevel. And the reason I do the shorter main bevel is it lets me feel the cut better. And by not forcing the tool, by feeling the cut and cutting at the speed it wants to cut, you get a cleaner cut just right from the start. So by having that little short bevel helps. And also when you're on the inside of the bowl, it acts more like, you know, when you adjust the mouth on a plane, and you adjust the mouth down so it holds the fibers down and gives you a cleaner cut on rough woods. Well, this sort of does the same thing in effect, is it keeps it a little closer to the wood and doesn't tear out the wood quite as bad. And what I usually do is I put it in here and I sharpen the main bevel, and then I simply move it forward and I go back and create that second bevel, and then when I'm done, I pull it out and I just grind away the bottom. So that's kind of how my tools sharpen. So sometimes they end up with 4 or 5 or 6 bevels down here, but it doesn't really matter because they don't do anything except get out of your way. So I just wanted to show you that to kind of give you an idea of, it adds a lot of consistency to your work. You're not changing things. What this adapter here does is, no matter if I go to somebody else's grinder or as my wheel wears down from 8 inches to 6 inches, if I put that in there, I get the same bevel every time. Now, you know, the concave area might be smaller because it's a 5-inch wheel, but it doesn't really matter. It's that main cut that matters. And so that's where those come in really handy. They're so easy to make. And if you've got a flat platform, I didn't bring the one I use on a flat platform, but all it does is it sits on there like that, and then these areas touch the wheel. And so for grinding skews and hand chisels and things, you know, I got these set up and it says on there skew or hand chisel or whatever it is. Even scrapers, I can set them up for that. So that gives me repeatable angles every time, saves a lot of hassle. So let's go back and grab a tool. I want to clean this up just real quick. You need to go on the other side, okay? Anybody have any questions on sharpening while we're at it? I'm currently playing with a lot of different systems. I've got a strip sander, I've got a Tormek wheel, I've got the CBN wheels, I've got the white wheels. And what I'm trying to learn is a couple of things. One is, number one, does sharpening to higher grits have any advantages for wood turners? My friend John Jordan, who's a tremendous turner, never really sharpens past 60 grit. He's turning green wood all the time. He gets fabulous cuts with a 60 grit wheel. I'm currently sharpening with, this one's done on 320 grit. Probably can't see it now because I was turning with it last night. But I'm playing with 320 grits and 180 grit and the Tormek wheel, which is supposedly around 1,000. And what I'm learning is the sharpness, the sharper you get it, or the finer, more polished it is, the longer the edge holds, but it's real subtle. In other words, you can kind of barely tell it, and the only way I can tell it is one day I sat there turning a whole bunch of spindles for production run, and I was switching tools back and forth constantly and trying to feel when one was dull versus the other. And it seems like, and I don't have any empirical formulas for this, but it seems like if you sharpen to a finer grit, it holds an edge a little bit longer. The downside is very easy to burn an edge. Of course, on high-speed steel, that's not really a problem. But you know, ideally, you don't want to do that if you can help it. Now you're on the Tormek wheel, of course, it's got a water bath, so that's not a problem. The thing that seems to make the most difference for me in getting really clean cuts is, number one, the tool angle. You know, bowl gouges are sharpened about 55 degrees, which is kind of blunt. My spindle gouges are 35 degrees, which is pretty sharp. This one's 40. That's the Stewart Batty grind. I've got a Hunter tool, carbide tool, which I'll be glad to talk about later if you want to. This carbide tool, the bevel on here is about like a bowl gouge, about 55 degrees, but the actual cutting angle, because it's a cup tool, is about 27 degrees. So that thing cuts really clean. Sweet tool, I like them. But so what I want to do is just go in here and just kind of...
Before you get into that, what are the variety of bowl gouge angles you use?
That I use?
Yeah.
I typically use this gouge right here for most things, 55 degrees. When I get a bowl, it's got steep sides, like he had that, this one, what was that, the spalted maple. When you get down into that transition area, you can't rub the bevel with a 55 degree gouge. You got to start in the middle and go back out. In that case, I used to have one ground at about, I'd call it 75 or 80 degrees, really blunt. And of course, it didn't give me as clean a cut, and that's why I switched over to the Hunter tools. The Hunter tool has one where the cutter is mounted perfectly flat. And you tilt it. You don't ever use it flat. If you do, it'll catch like crazy. It's like sticking a skew in there without rubbing a bevel. But if you tilt it and rub the bevel, the handle almost sticks straight out, because what it is, it's got a 7-degree bevel on the cutter. So you got effectively about 82 degrees. That means I can get in the bottom of a really steep bowl and still rub the bevel with that Hunter. It's a Hunter number 4 or Hunter number 5. The one that I picked up here was the Osprey. No, excuse me, this one is the Hercules. It's got a square shank. The Hercules, the cutter's tilted forward at 30 degrees. And what that does is it now matches the angle of my bowl gouge as far as bevel rubbing, almost identical. So I use it exactly the same way. I lay it on there, rub the bevel, and do a push cut, just like I would with my bowl gouge. But it won't reach in the bottom of the bowl any more than the other one will. Because again, you've got that angle. Well, it's right here, I'm rubbing the bevel, and you can see the angle's about, I don't know, what would you call that, 45 degrees? So, you know, I couldn't really turn a bowl and rub the bevel all the way to the bottom. But on my mirrors and things that I turn most frequently, you know, it's a fantastic tool, because I can get in there and use this tool and get really clean edges with it. So we're just going to go in there and kind of quickly, and I'll show you one other trick I learned over the years. I have to get a different tool rest. Hang on a second. I forgot what we were doing here. Hate to have my back turned to an audience. It is probably my best side, but you know, y'all have to understand that. When I turn my mirrors, typically they're larger in the, I don't know if you can tell it with this one. See how the middle's slightly taller and it goes kind of down a little bit on the sides? Well, in order to do that, I have to cut downhill with the grain, which means turning forward, I'm doing this. And it's really a pain in the butt to try to hold your arm steady and get a really clean cut. If you move your arm like this any at all as you're going, you're getting a mild ripple. You don't get that really smooth, clean arc. So it occurred to me one day, why don't I walk around to the back side of the lathe? You know? So you walk over here, and now I can put the tool on my hip, flex my legs a little bit, and I can get a really clean cut going all the way out. Works fantastic. Fortunately, I bought a Powermatic a few years ago, and it's got reverse. So now I can turn it in reverse, and I can put the tool against my body. I can rub the bevel till I get a cut, And now I'm turning out, again, I'm trying to relax my grip, trying to feel the cut, turn as gently as I can, as I want the cleanest cut I can get. And now I've got more control because it's against my body, and I've got controlling it from 16 inches away. Now, typically what I do in demos is I forget. I start talking to the crowd, and I start trying to round over the edge, and it won't cut. And you're thinking, why won't it cut? Because I'm cutting right here. It's turning the wrong way. So you have to stop every now and then and rethink how you're doing things. I'm not going to take much time turning because most of this is going to be about the router. So I just want to clean it up to the point that it's real clean. Almost no sanding at all. I could hit that with 220 real easily. I didn't take off as much in the middle as I should have, but we won't spend much more time turning because I want to talk about the fun stuff. When I first started using the router, I had a shop smith, and I did everything on it's kind of a long lathe, with a table on it and all that kind of junk. And so I built a box, and I would turn my spindle, and I'd take the router and I'd set it down in that box, and I'd run it along. And one of the problems I ran into, and I don't have a good example of that sitting here. Yeah, kind of. One of the things I ran into was when you run the router wrong here, if you don't pull it out really quick, you get a burn spot on both edges. Now you can get a router speed controller and slow it down. That helps a little. But now if you slow it down too much, you don't get really clean cuts in the bottom. So what I did was I built little ramps. So as the router goes along there, it just comes out of the cut. And that way I don't get those burned areas. The other option is what I do on these is you go ahead and you run the router all the way over to here and over to here, and you add a detail later. So I turned away these areas. That was where it was burned. But as I down cut it like that and then cut a bead on there, you don't see the burn marks. So that kind of saved you on that problem. So that's one of the problems you run into using a router on the lathe or on this kind of wood, is that it's very easy to burn the wood. In some cases, it doesn't matter at all. You can, after I learned how to do that, put flutes in my handles or put flutes on things, I started doing things where you take a hollow vessel, and unfortunately I don't have any good examples with me tonight because they've all been sold. This is one of them, where I started putting little curved areas in it. I wanted to match the curve, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a couple of minutes. And of course, doing faceplate work. And then one of the things I'm going to talk about toward the end here is how to make them look like they're spirals. They're not spirals, but they kind of look that way. Don't know which TV we're on. Yeah, there we go. But I'll show you how to do that. I use indexing to get the spirals, and I'm going to talk to you about indexing wheels. These are my little cupcakes. Somebody was asking me about this, and I've forgotten what that stuff is now. AAW Journal had an article about a year ago on how to make your own gaskets for your vacuum press, and it's actually a formula that they use in the movie industry to make all these masks, to make rubber for the masks. And they call it Sugru. This isn't Sugru, it's got another name, and I forget the name of it now. But it's all it is clear silicone caulking and cornstarch. And you add some colorant. And by varying the amount of cornstarch, you get a little different densities or whatever. It's not the best thing in the world for making the icing. I mean, it's indestructible, which is cool because these are screw lid boxes. But I've come up with a better formula now that you get from a company called Smooth On, and I've got to work on it more before I feel like I can teach it to anybody. So let me, let's see. Yeah, we're all right. So let's get on with the meat of the system now. Basically what you got to do is you got to build some sort of platform. Where did I lay the one that I was using? Oh, that's it right there. Yeah. No, it'd probably be okay. These I'm going to use in just a second. So, oops. Clunk, clunk, clunk. See, they're indestructible. No, I make enough of them that's not a problem. what you have to rig up. Now, first of all, your wood turners, nothing that says you can't make it out of wood. You need a platform to put the router on. So you can make them out of wood if you want to. The problem is, of course, the screw that goes in here will dent them. And so periodically you have to make a new tenon. If you can come up with a better way to put a base plate on, I've done several different ways over the years. Well, actually the first one that I made I wanted to show you. If you're going to do really intricate work, this fits on the lathe. Doesn't use my banjo at all. It just clamps on there. But the nice thing is, it swivels back here. I can loosen it up and I can tap this and swivel it real slightly. It adjusts forward and back. And I've got fences over here, fences over here. Everything turns 90 degrees if I need to. So I can do very fine controls with this one. It's a little bit of a pain to set up. And of course, when I travel, I never know what lathe I'm going to be on. So it doesn't fit most of the lathes. So then one day, to try to get a little less complicated, but still be able to travel, I made sort of the same thing. This one has screws that go through there. I've taken them off right now. But this goes up and down so that I can fit it on a mini lathe, or I can fit it on a jet like this, 16-inch or whatever, instead of my 20-inch lathe. And it still slides forward in track, and I've got bases, that lock on. And that one's pretty handy. There we go, comes apart. Fits rather tight. What I started using after I built all of these was I took a floor plate and I put some threads on some drill rod, and then I mount that. This is the one I use at home most often. It won't fit on this lathe adequately, but it's got a little fence. You can make the fence permanent or you can take the fence off. I'm going to show you how to use the fence in a few minutes. This one also has holes in it, and I'll show you why those are there in just a couple of minutes. So we'll leave that sitting down. Got a mini lathe. I countersunk it because it wouldn't go down low enough. One of the problems you run into, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is mounting the router or the Dremel or whatever into some kind of holder. But we'll get into that in a minute. But what I want to stick with right now is how to mount these on there. Another method that I use for some special things is being able to fine-tune the height. I put some drill rod in there. In this case, I think I actually just welded it on the back side. You do end up, it's handy to be able to stick these in a chuck, and you can take a file while it's spinning and face them off to make them run true, and that way your table sits real true. If it doesn't for some reason, you can actually shim it. When you attach it here, if it doesn't set perfectly true, you can shim it. And I just went to a demo by J. Paul Fennell this last week, and his table tilts because he wants to do simulated spirals on his pieces. He lays them out using the tilt. He doesn't really use a router. He hand carves it all, which takes for 1,000 years to do. But that way, with his tilting table, he can draw lines on there and get the designs the way he wants it. So there's a lot of options for building a table. You kind of design it for what you need. In this case, I got a little simple one here that fortunately is just about right for the jet. I mean, for the, What you run into when I first started doing things, of course, I was using my Dremel. I've got a Dremel. I got one of these set up for a Fordham. And for most of the cuts, you want it mounted so it's on the center line. In this case, it just happens to be lucky and it actually works. I make a base for them, and some of my bases have 2 screws. Some of my bases have 1 screw. I make what I did on these tools. This one allows me to mount the router straight up and down, so I can use cutters that spin this way. I'll show you why I use one that's sitting at 45 degrees in a minute, but these bases were designed with the router sits flat, and I use those primarily when I'm cutting spindles or I want to route on a hollow vessel. And what I've got is the single bit is for concave surfaces. If I want to do some kind of concave cut, I use those. Now it's up to you to kind of keep it roughly parallel to the face of the wood then. With the double screws on there, that's for convex surfaces or flat surfaces. The nice thing about using screws instead of just pieces of wood is it's kind of tricky sometimes to set the depth of cut because I'm kind of bumping my banjo. This way I can just loosen the screw or tighten the screw, 1/4 of a turn, and it moves it in a few thousandths of an inch and saves you a lot of hassle when you really, really need to get finicky about the depth of cut. But these bases are real quick to change out then. And this one, coupled with this one, lets me do spirals. I mean, not spirals, but curves. I can mount my router on this base, and I've got this little pin right there, and the pin sits in one of those holes, and it'll just rotate through the cut. So if I want to cut an arc of some kind, I can do that. It's just one option I've been playing with lately. So there's lots and lots of things you can do. One day, when I was cutting these jigs, one of the problems I run into when cutting grooves is that the router bit spins like this. Well, a couple of things I'm going to talk about real quick. I'll pull the router bits up here, some of them. Started off, of course, using either V-bit or a round bit. And one of the problems I ran into with V-bits is 90-degree V-cutters aren't 90 degrees. They're like 87. I bought how many of these dang things. I finally found out Freud sells one that is 90 degrees. And actually Whiteside had one that was 90 degrees also. All the rest of them I picked up would cut a groove. What happened was I was cutting a groove in a piece of wood like this, and the V grooves, it looked like it was flush, but then you started cutting down into it and the bottom was hollow, where the V wasn't sitting all the way in, and that's because my squares of wood were cut at 90 degrees and the blocks were 80, and the hole was 87. So one day it dawned on me that, well, you got another problem was this is spinning, and the outside edges, of course, you've got that high surface speed, so the outside edges are cutting pretty clean, but the bottom of the groove is not cutting really clean because the bottom of that cutter is not moving very fast from a surface speed standpoint. So I was having to go back and sand the bottom of every groove, which was you do 36 sides like on my cupcakes. It takes a long time to sand all those out. So it dawned on me one day that if the cutter was spinning this way through the work, you've got the full surface speed down there. So that's why I built this jig. The router sits on here, the cutter sits down there like that, and I can go through there and I can cut it 90 degrees. The problem I ran into with this jig, and it does work really good for some things, the problem I ran into with this jig was sometimes the router got in the way of the work. If you were trying to cut a platter and you wanted to cut on the rim, the platter would hit the router, even using my trim router, which is fairly thin. So it didn't always work. So then it dawned on me one day, if you look at how ornamental lathes work, ornamental lathes have a little bitty ball, and you mount a cutter in that ball of different shapes, and the cutter spins like this. So it's always going through the wood at a pretty high RPM, pretty high surface speed, if you want to look at it that way. So it dawned on me that if I take a straight bit and I mount it at 45 degrees, the corner is 90 degrees. I get the same thing my little 90-degree bit was doing, but now the bottom is moving very fast through the cut, and I get a pretty clean cut. Now still, you don't get super clean cuts everywhere because we're dealing with a turning with the grain running this way. There's going to be a period of time where I'm turning across grain. There's going to be a period of time when I'm turning with the grain. So you're never going to get super clean cuts all the time. You may have to go in there and take really light cuts, 2 or 3 depths. So we're going to set this up real quick and kind of show you how that works. And then we'll talk about some of the problems and some of the differences. And I'm probably the only one that brought hearing protection tonight. One of the things that's handy to do is to have a... Do it? Oh, yeah. Oh, you're woodworkers. I forgot. Wait a minute. He used a scroll saw. It didn't make any noise. Well, you can hum when it's purring. I went out and bought one of the... my mind just went blank. DeWalt. Silas Koff was doing demos, or was doing a class at Appalachian Center for Crafts where I used to work, and they were trying to figure out how they could buy these real expensive scroll saws. And he said, "No, get the DeWalt. It's fantastic." And so that's what they bought, 12 of them. So I bought one after that too, and they work fantastic. You have a couple of ways of indexing on lathes. One is some lathes have indexing, but they usually never have enough. They have 12 holes or 24 holes if you're lucky. Sometimes, on rare occasions, you find one with 36 holes. Most of the time, it's something like 16 or 24. And that's okay. You can make your own discs very easily, make them so they fit out here, and all you do is you draw a circle and you take a compass and you kind of estimate. Let's say you wanted to have 51 holes. You kind of guess what 51 will go around there, and you set the compass and you kind of step it off. And if it's not quite right, you make a tiny adjustment and you do it again. It's a pain in the butt doing it that way, but you can get really odd shaped indexes if you need to. This particular wheel comes from a company called Iron Fire. If you go online, it's ironfirellc.com. I guess I should write that down so everybody can, because it's a really good index wheel. It works fantastic. www.ironfire, oops. It's probably why I wasn't a teacher. I can't write. lc.com. Anyway, these things are like $24. They're virtually indestructible. And when they sent mine, the postman folded it up and stuck it in the mailbox. I went out there and pulled it out and went, oh crap, this thing's ruined. Nah, it flattened itself right back out. I've been using it now for, I don't know, 10 or 12 years or more. But they have 14, 36, 48, and 60 holes. I'll pass this around. You know, of course, if you can do math, if you can't do math, you just look at this and figure it out. But if you can do math, you just figure out how many holes you want and which thing to use. So we'll do, and they give you a little tiny pin that goes in. Now you have to build your own index lock. The easiest way to do it is to build an L-shaped thing that, what I did on mine at home, well, two things. One was it attaches down here with magnets. Well, it's got a block, so it sits in the way so it can't move, and the magnets kind of keep it locked down. And it's got an L-arm that comes up here, and it's got 4 sets of holes. And the holes go in there, and you can set it in any one of these holes. Now, what I've rigged up for traveling is this little thing like this, because I never know what lathe I'm going to be on. And so I just kind of jury-rigged this. And it's not the best in the world, because it moves just a tiny bit. Ideally, you want it to be pretty solid. Is that showing what you need to see?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to pick 36. We're going to do 12 sides. Obviously that would be 3 on there. So what I do is I make a little block like this. It's the height, that's center height. And I go out there and I make a cut. And I go 1, 2, 3. And I make a little line. And I find it's real advantageous to go ahead and, even though you know what you want, to make a pencil line and make sure that it looks right. Because it's so easy to screw up.
It's like measure twice and cut once.
Oh gosh. Years ago, one of the magazines came out with a thing, you know, using a rule, use the 1-inch mark instead of the end, because the end is never accurate. It made sense, but I ended up with boards that were 1 inch too short all the time. So then somebody made the concept that you use the 10-inch mark. Well, that made a lot more sense. And I've never cut a board too short by using the 10-inch mark, but you're constantly having to go, was that 50 or 60? So, you know, it works, but like you say, you measure as many times as you have to and you still screw up. I inherited that from my dad. I try to blame it on him. Yeah.
They call him Shorty.
Yeah. It's like call him lucky for missing thumbs, fingers. So if you go ahead and you make the lines, that does a couple of things. When you're doing a glue up like this, what you run into is, in this case, I purposely made the blocks bigger than I absolutely needed to fill these little gaps. And in this case, they're short, so I could glue them all in one setting. The longer ones you see back down in there, the middle of the wood actually touched each other. So I could only glue 6 at a time. I glue 6, I turn those down, roughly flush, then I glue 6 more, turn more down. Well, marking these things off kind of gives you an idea that they're too close for where I'm doing it. I'm going to run into a problem like that, or I need to plan something different. But mostly, it just kind of gives you a better idea for, is 12 going to be right? If it's not, then I need to do something else. Do 36, do whatever you want to do to make those cuts. So that gives me a ballpark idea of what's going on. Now the other problem you run into is you need to set your router so it's on the center. Now you can only move the router bit out or in so far. So a lot of times you have to move it up and down. And before I came up with this screw attachment on there, what I did was took some PVC pipe And I made adapters from 125 thousandths up to who knows what that one is. And I just simply stack them up on here until my router bit is close enough that I can adjust it and get it right on the center. And that way, whatever lathe I've got, or maybe I want to do a different cut, maybe I put a different router bit in there, something changed. So I've got all these little adapters I can just slide on. And of course, you got to keep up with them. And I found that in my drawer one day. That worked pretty well. The bad thing about the screw thing, it works really great. But every time you tighten that thing down, you put a dent in the screw. And so every so often, you got to take a V-tool and go in here and clean up the grooves, or the nut doesn't adjust anymore. So it has pros and cons. But I'll show you why I made it and why I use it in a few minutes. So let's pick something. We picked 12, and we'll make a cut. Now, the other thing I've got to do is, I've got to decide, do I want it parallel? Do I want it, how do I want to make it cut? I don't have a bearing writing on here. Now, you can do that. You can make, at home somewhere, and I couldn't find it, or I would have brought it this time. I have an attachment that sits on here and has a wheel on it. And that'll rub on there, and it'll make the same depth cut every time, no matter what the shape of this is. If I'm trying to follow a hollow vessel, and I want to cut flutes in the side, like I did that black box over there, you know, I can put that on there, and it'll follow the vessel. Don't have any troubles at all. Or you can make a platform like that. You know, what I can do, and I do this a lot at home, is I take a pencil and I slide it along my piece. And then I have this laying on the ground, and I slide it along there, and it makes an arc. I take it over to the scroll saw or the band saw, and I cut the arc, and I sand it down so it's nice and smooth. And now I've got the shape of my vessel, and I can follow that vessel. Or I can purposely make it so the router bit comes out of the cut somewhere. You know, if I want to flare it out sometime, I can do that. And the router bit will kind of start over here, then it'll start cutting, go around, come back out of the cut. So when you make your guide, you can make it any shape you want. Now at home, typically, most of mine have a platform already on them, some kind of edge. And that's always straight, of course, and I can just kind of clamp that against it. Coming down here, I didn't have that, so I borrowed this piece of steel from them. Way bigger than I need, but it will work. Let's see here. So, find my clamps, there they are. Anybody have any questions while I'm clamping this up?
Can you show us a couple of pieces you work before you go much further so we can kind of see where you're going?
Yep. Well, what I want to do is make a couple cuts, and then we'll stop, and I'm going to show you pros and cons of different things, different bits, different cuts. But let's see if you'll. Well, the simplest, of course, was just a flute. You know, if I wanted to cut flutes across there, I put a round bit in, I line this up on the face, and I run it across, and I cut a flute. And you know, you'll have to sand them afterwards. You put a dowel. Take a dowel and glue some sandpaper to it or wrap sandpaper to it, and you can sand them if you need to. What we're going to do here, and you know, you'll understand it more once I make a cut, and then we can stop and talk about the pros and cons and the problems. Did I not get that centered? Nope, I didn't. Okay. Oh, I see what I did. Yeah. There we go. Okay. Got to start at page 1. One of the things I do at home that I didn't bring with me is I use popsicle sticks a lot of times for depth, because to be able, if you want something to run out on a cut, like this one's deep up here, shallow right there, and I wanted to know that's how it's going to be. So what I do is I put a popsicle stick or two, depending on how deep I want to be. In this case, it was probably 2 popsicle sticks deep at the deepest point.
Don't have that measurement.
Yeah, that's exactly.
They don't have those out there. I can't get you one.
Dang. So what I do is I put the popsicle stick in there and I run it across here until it touches in both points. And then I know it's exactly that deep, and I can pull the popsicle stick, it'll drop in, and it'll go that deep. The other option would be to simply screw the screws in, however many turns that you think you might want to cut. In this case, I'm just going to eyeball it, and we're going to make a pass and see where it is. Right there, it's too deep. I don't want it that deep. So I'm going to tilt it. There we go. And then we'll go back and make a tiny adjustment. Now this is why, part of why I built that fancier rig, and I actually have one at home that I've been playing with using one of those inexpensive cross-side vices that you buy from Harbor Freight. There we go. Okay, that's about right. And what I can do on the Harbor Freight was I can dial it in thousandths of an inch at a time. But it only fits on a lathe that's 20 inches or taller, so it wasn't very practical for this. Well, everybody hold their ears a second. I'm going to show you a couple of tricks. Okay, first of all, you probably noticed a couple things. One is there's no guard on here. You got to keep your wits about you, or you got to build a guard for it. Fortunately, I've been very lucky. The other thing that I do, this is just a rough piece of plywood, been sanded or whatever. The other ones have been used so much that the router will vibrate and fall off the lathe. I take one of these little things that I often use for reverse turning bowls that fits over my chuck, little rubber friction thing, lay it out there. After I make the cut, I'll set it on that. It's not going to vibrate and fall off, because if it falls off, what's your first catch? You want to catch it. That is a no-no. So, keep your wits about you, or put some guards on it. Do something else to keep from getting hurt, because it is a dangerous tool. The other thing is, as you notice when you look in here, you can see that one right there. I'm cutting across the grain. It's tearing out one side, not the other side. That one's okay. That one's got a little tear out. That one's got a little tear out. So typically what I do in those cases is I get my little square dowel rod, kind of bend it around the corner and just go in there and sand. Now it depends on what you're going to do with it. I'm going to talk about the other options you have right now. First of all is part of the way this got started many years ago. I used to make a lot of clocks, and I found out that if you drilled an angle through a piece, that the dowel would end up oval shaped when you turned it down, which was kind of cool. It was always a pain in the butt to drill at an angle. You know how you do that? You're a wood turner. Turn a square shoulder. You can drill through the square shoulder. You're going to turn it away later, so it doesn't matter. So that made it a lot easier. But that's kind of what got me started playing with the router on the lathe. If you use different router bits, let's see, this was a V-groove router bit. You get a point at the bottom. This was a rounded bit, so you get a rounded bottom. This was a square bit, so you get a square bottom. From the top, they don't look tremendously different. Where they're flat, they could all be a 1/2 inch wide depending on which bit I use and how deep I cut it. But what you see on the edges changes. Now what I'm doing with this cut, and I did it a tiny bit on this disc right here, this is similar to what they do when they do pool cues. If you look at a lot of I can't talk tonight, pool cues, they have a long taper, goes all the way down, and all they do is cut a V-groove down the middle and glue a block in and turn it away later. So I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. These have been cut. I made them a slightly bit deeper back here than at the front. And one of the problems you run into, if anything flexes, the router flexes, maybe I don't set it on the gauge as good, you'll notice on this one right there, And that one right there, my router actually carried into the wood just a tiny bit. So what I'd probably have to do is go back afterwards and return that to get away from that little nick to get out of there. So it helps to plan, take a couple of secondary cuts. The other thing is to help prevent this tear out that I was getting. Number one, if you'll go back and you'll sharpen these with a diamond hone before you start cutting, they'll cut cleaner. And the second thing is, and this is where my popsicle sticks come in, if I know it's going to be 3 popsicle sticks deep, I'll pull out 1 popsicle stick and I'll make cuts. Then I'll pull out 2 and make a cut and pull out 3. And that way I haven't made as big a cut all the way across. And you can, on rare occasions, do what we call a climb cut, where you're cutting against the grain. In other words, most of these I was actually cutting uphill against the grain because I was going from outside in, and this was tapered real slightly. I should have been going this direction, but if you go that direction, you're climb cutting because the router bit's rotating that way. So what you can do, that I could set it up and cut from the middle out, just like I did a while ago when I was turning. Now I'm cutting in the uphill rotation of the bit, but I'm cutting downhill with the grain. Does that make sense? Gets complicated. But if you use a router bit much, you kind of figure out which way you're supposed to feed it. And then you try to figure out how can I make it cut downhill with the grain while I'm cutting in that direction. And then you'll understand how it cuts a little cleaner. Because cutting uphill like I'm doing now, I'm going to get more tear out than I did before. If you're going to glue blocks in like this, it may not matter. The tear out's going to be covered and filled in with glue, and you're probably okay. Does everybody kind of understand how that works? You know, if I want to cut a curved edge, you know, I take that, lay it on there now, and my router bit will make a curved line in my work. Or I can fade it out, or I could make it convex and make the router kind of follow that convex corner. Remind me to talk more about hollow vessels in a couple of minutes, because there's some cool things you can do with those. I think where I'm at. Okay, yeah, I know where I'm at. So we'll get this off of here. I just bought a house and I'm having to move, and I'm one of those people who believes you cannot have too many clamps. Well, I'm starting to wonder, because it's really hard to pack that many clamps, particularly the long ones. I think I counted the other day, and not counting my squeeze clamps, I have over 120. And I use them every now and then. So, let's see, I'm done with that, so let's get that out of the way before I hurt somebody. And my dad had to give up woodworking about a year ago because he had a stroke and he can't remember how to do it anymore. So now I have more clamps after this trip. Where'd I put the tool rest? There it is. Now for those who want to make a hand mirror, I typically put a glue block on the back. I turn the opening, and then I use 4-inch jaws so I can just expand back into it, and then I can turn the other part. If you can't do that, what I do is I have a glue block and I glue it on with CA glue and accelerator. And the reason I use the accelerator is it makes the glue joint brittle. So when I break that block off, it won't break the block and it won't break the wood, it breaks the glue joint. So what I do is I put my square block in my chuck, and I turn this opening, I break this off, then I turn the square block down until it just barely fits that opening. So it now becomes kind of a jam chuck. Use a square block because I'm going to glue it back on with CA glue and accelerator again, but now I can get a chisel in one of the square sizes and pop it back off. That's hard to follow, I know, but we're not turning mirrors tonight, so. But that's technically what these are. I turn a lot of hand mirrors. That's kind of what I'm known for. When you glue these blocks in like this, if you go back and forth like you would with a spindle roughing gouge, the grain runs long ways, and you can rip out a really big chunk and tear a hole in your surface that you wanted to turn. So typically what you do is, let me turn this down a little bit. There we go. Find my bowl gouge, there it is. If you'll always cut across the grain, in other words, high point to low point, then you won't chip them out. Now I'm going to go outside. I'm going to cut high point to low point. Now I'm going down just to the wood, so I want to stop before I get all the way to the bottom. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a pull cut and just kind of trim those off a little bit. See how close we are there? Pretty close. But you can see what I did here is I set the router up so it was cutting deep as it entered, shallow as it came out. And again, I drew my pencil lines to kind of get an idea and cut them. And then I went back and went in between those two and cut the other ones. Now, there's a couple of ways to do that. One is if you know you're going to have a nice even number that divides into these numbers, all you can do is skip the appropriate holes. But let's suppose you can't for some reason. What I found really handy to do is I take dividers and I step off between two spaces and I find the exact center. I set my tool rest up so it's on the center and we'll actually almost touch that edge. I'll loosen the chuck up and I'll just rotate it until it lines up to that point. That lets me pick a division in between the two that might not work on my normal, let's say you've only got 24 lines and you want to do some 48 cuts. Well, you could do the 24 cuts, then you could shift this halfway in between and do 24 more and split the difference. You got to be real precise when you do that. So always do a little test cut first and see. But that's how you can kind of split the difference. You can end up with patterns like this. Or you could do 3 patterns. Do one long, one short, and skip a couple and do 3 more. So you have these repeated patterns around something. When I first started using the router to do these, the router was always in a router table. I wasn't doing it on anything. So I'd take a platter, I'd take a square block, it was going to be a platter, and I'd run it through the lathe. So all my patterns were at 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, whatever. But I could move the thing up and down and get 3 over here and 3 over here that were parallel, do things like that. Probably, I think it was one of the first articles that I had in the AAW Journal was a platter that had 3 lines. It was actually a mine just went blank, an offertory platter for a friend of mine's church in Indiana. And so I cut 3 grooves in one side of the rim, put contrasting pieces of maple in there. To me, that simulated Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and they loved it. And it was a simple project, easy to do. It's probably some of the first inlays that I started doing many, many years ago. And that sort of slowly led to starting to play with the router on the lathe. So does everybody kind of understand how this works? You could use any bit you want. You could use round bits and put round dowels in there. In this case, I'm using a V bit or a 90-degree bit at an angle and putting square blocks in there and just turning the square blocks down. There's just about anything you want to do. Oh, a really fun thing to do is you cut all these V grooves and you glue all these blocks in there and you don't change anything. Don't take it out of your chuck. Don't do anything. After the glue is dry and you turn it down flush, readjust your router so it's shallower and make more cuts. Now glue a contrasting piece in. Now it looks like you have little pieces of veneer in there. Now there's nothing wrong with taking a square block and gluing veneer on there first and gluing it in there. That's an option also. So there's a lot of possibilities for doing this kind of thing. If you've already got the index wheel, drill some holes in there and put a dowel in. Now you've got like a long tapered pin with a hole at the end, with a dot at the end. There's lots of options once you get the index wheel and start playing. I think everybody kind of understand the difference in the bottom. You can see on here the edge is V-shaped because I use that 90-degree bit at an angle. If I wanted that edge to be rounded or square, I could just use a different bit and a different way of mounting the router. So let's talk about hollow vessels real quick. Let me have that black one back. Or either one of these. I'll take all 3 of these. That one, and that one. Yeah. Your microphone's not as bad. My microphone that I use when I do my video. Oh, by the way, if you go to YouTube and you type in John 60 Lucas, it'll bring up all my videos. None of them are project videos. They're all on problem solving. how to get cleaner cuts, how to set up your grinder, how to sharpen, little things like that. So they're kind of handy to see. To do a piece like this is pretty simple. It's almost exactly like I did that one. You get your hollow vessel, you turn it, you sand it, get it pretty much down to finish, and you go back and you decide how many indexes do I want around there. And you can either measure around it and divide, and that gives you, say, I want 36, and then you can kind of try to calculate the depth. It gets a little mathematically challenged, so what I usually do is use the pencil. Draw a bunch of lines and try to figure out how deep can I go, and I usually sneak up on them. I do the first 2 cuts. I'll do the first cut, move it, do another cut, and then I'll back up to the first cut and I'll bump this ever so slightly, and I'll make another cut until I get them deep enough to leave the gap between them, the kind of spacing that I want. And that's where it would be real. That's where my new little setup with that vise comes in. I can adjust it 5 thousandths, move it in just a hair and test it again. You know, it's very precise, but like I say, it's limited. The thing sits up so huge, you got to have a huge lathe to even work with the thing. To do flutes like this, I did the opposite. You can do one of 2 things. You can do the opposite of this. I can make a concave guide, and then I take my little router base that has 1 pin on it, and I kind of follow that. This was a convex guide, so I made convex, and I just followed that, but I made the shape such that as it comes over here, the router would run up that way. As it gets down the bottom, the router just runs out of the cut, and that way I don't have that burn problem. In this case, it didn't matter because I bleached it and painted it, so who cares? But one of the vessels I did that was a lot of fun was I wanted a hollow vessel that looked like you had peeled a slice out of an orange. So you had this level that was, you know, below the other level, 1/4 of an inch, but it followed the shape exactly. And so what I did was I built an attachment like a finger that stuck out there like that, and that would follow the vessel exactly. And so then I simply took the router and I mounted this, and I took a straight bit and I made a cut from top to bottom, and I moved it so the bit overlapped the last cut. And I did it again, and I did it again, and did it again until I got it all the way out of there. Now I got really smart one day and thought I would go around and leave raised ridges and reduced ridges. Well, you got to remember that follower may not follow the high point all the time. As you rotate it around, it may follow a shallow point. So that particular vessel has half of the vessel low and half of the vessel high, because I got about 3 of those turned and I cut through one of them. Oh crap, what do I do now? So you got to plan some of these things out depending on the details you do. But that's also a very good way to do fluting, is just to have a finger on here that would touch your round dowel, and you just move it up, touch it down, slide it across, and you got it done. You don't have to build a big box or big fancy jigs if you don't want to. It's always an option. Something like that is very simple because you're going to run the router all the way through it. So there's no stopping. So the only hard part is adjusting the router so that it is the same depth here as the same depth here. And again, that's where the popsicle sticks come in, or any other kind of device you want. You know, if you want to make them a 1/4 inch deep and you've got a 1/4 inch drill, you just lay the drill down there. You bump your screws up to it, and you adjust your tool rest until the router bit just touches the wood, exactly the same on both sides. You pull your drill bit out, and now it's going to make a 1/4 inch deep cut. I use drill bits a lot because my the screws on this thing, as you can see, are sitting really close to the ground. So a lot of times I can just stick a 3/32 drill bit in there, and I know it'll be exactly 3/32 of an inch deep then when I cut it. As long as you do your divisions correctly, what I've done here, if you'll notice, these have a tiny bit of spiral to them. So what I'm going to do real quick is show you how you do spirals, because it's very, very easy. I laid, yeah, there it is. We'll turn another blank real quick. Oops. always feel like I should be singing or something while I'm doing that, you know. Just singing in the rain. You know, that used to be one of my favorite songs, and then I saw the movie Clockwork Orange, and they had this person down on the ground, and he's just going, just singing in the rain, boom, kicking him. And now it's all I can ever think of when I hear that song. It's going to ruin the song for me. All right, that should be decent enough. Not perfect, it's pretty crappy wood. Got some tear out. I could go back and make a cut. No, it's too shallow. I'll cut through. I was going to say I could make a cut with a hunter tool and solve that problem, but I won't. Okay, the trick to cutting spirals. It dawned on me one day, and that's why I built this, that what happens if you go above or below center? Well, what it does is the blue one laying somewhere. There it is. If you go below center and you make these straight cuts, there's no crooked about them or anything, it appears to spiral. And if you actually make it, if you can envision one of those candy kisses, if you kind of make it like that, it almost acts like it wraps around that little candy kiss. But you're cutting a straight line each time. You just tilt the angle, or you cut a groove, or you make a platform to follow a pattern so that it goes around and follows that pattern. But it's cutting a straight line. If you mount it below center, they'll spiral this way. If you do it above center, they'll spiral this way. And I didn't do one. I should have done one before I came here, and I didn't have time. But when you cut below center and then above center on the same piece, you get a cross hatching. Now, you got to take really light cuts because it tears out unless it's a really solid wood. Black wood, cocobolo, something like that will do it. But if you're doing it out of softer woods, it'll tear out those little high points. It just won't work. So what we're going to do real quick. Yeah, pass it around, huh? I'm going to show you how to do that particular thing right there. What did I do with my small table? There it is. I shouldn't have taken that clamp piece off because now I need it. Now, one thing you'll find handy is C-clamps, narrow C-clamps. They don't get in the way like these big ones. But unfortunately, when I was packing to move the other day, I packed all of my C-clamps. I just did a demo for the club that Mike and Jack are in, and it's the natural edge bowls, and my fiance had packed all of my samples. I didn't know which box they were in, so I couldn't do those. Now I'm just kind of guessing where the run out's going to be on this, so we'll just bump it right there and call it quits. Okay. One of the things I forgot to tell you a minute ago is the little pin they give you is smaller than this. When you get it, it's really easy to lose them. Now I have a metal lathe, so I made myself another one, but you have to use a numbered drill bit. It's not a standard letter size drill bit or numbered size. It's a, or I mean, brain's gone. Fractional size. It's an odd size. I don't remember which size it is now, but it's really strange. Let's do 14. No, that won't be enough.
You're not going to do pencils first?
No, we're going to brave it. But you know what? It's kind of like a chainsaw. It works better when you turn it on.
No. Why so it doesn't move?
Yeah.
You got your pad? You want to put?
No, I'm not going to on this one because I'm going to move it so fast.
Okay.
Well, actually, this piece of wood has so much friction that you turn it on, it just sits there. fact, it has so much friction, it's hard for me to move it smoothly. And that's why my other ones are actually waxed a little bit, and it moves very precisely. Okay, now these are straight in. So what I'm going to do is raise it up. Let's see here. Make sure that's locked down. And how far above center is that? That'll probably work. Okay. So the first ones were straight in with the bit right on center. Now they're curved. See if I did enough of them to be, yeah, you can see the curve on there. Now we're going to have a little fun. If I don't quit dropping everything. If you get yourself an ink brayer, and it does work better with ink, with roller type ink, but we're going to use paint. I hope this paint's still good. Well, I can't get the lid off. There we go. Sounds like it's moving inside there.
Good sound.
Is that an acrylic paint?
Yeah. And that's the reason I have it on there is because the lid's broken. Won't do its thing. So what you do is you just kind of thin it out to where the roller's rolling. If you look at that blue one that I passed around, kind of got in a hurry the other night and I used it a little too thick and so it bled into the crevices on some of them. Pull my pen out so I can rotate it. But anyway, what the ink brayer does, of course, is it follows the high points. I think I have to give credit to, I think it was Clay Foster that showed me this many, many moons ago. Even though I should have known it because we did, probably all did too, ink blots in art school and elementary school or junior high or whatever scary it was. Should have sanded it first. Well, just for interest's sake, the area where I had tear out. Yeah. We'll highlight the tear out while we're at it. Call it a feature. There we go. So anyway, I hope, does everybody kind of understand how that works? Simple little process to decorate something. You can go back and turn through it. You know, I got it on these inner areas in here. What I would do is once it dries, I'd just go back and turn that away and get good clean edges. Same thing where it bled over the edges out here just a little bit. I go back and clean up that outer edge and that's done. I think that's about it. I mean, there's other ways you could go. If you all start playing, you'll figure out something because it's a lot of fun. Anybody have any questions?
Have you figured out how to put a twist on something?
Yep. Well, there's several ways.
With a router.
Yeah, there's several ways. I was going to say, I've done it the hard way, of course. Carve it. Mine just went blank. Stuart Mortimer out of England has a fantastic book. Shows you how to do it. I do it a little different than he does. I take a hacksaw and carve down.
You haven't figured it out
To
with a
do,
router.
yeah, there's two ways. I have, if you're lucky and you can find them, Sears Router Crafter. They quit making them, God, I don't know how many years ago, 20 maybe. You can still find them online. There is, I think, in the last AAW Journal, there was an ad for one in the back. It's actually a video. You have to build it. And it's complicated, but it works extremely well. I stayed at a guy's house up in Johnson City, and he'd built one. And it's real complicated because you can vary it tremendously to get the spiral, the amount of depth, the amount of twist, and everything else in it. It's real complicated. There's also one in Bill Hilton has a router book. And I'd have to, unfortunately, I packed all those. I was going to look up exactly which one the other night, and it's packed in a box. But one of Bill Hilton's big, thick books on how to use a router has how to build one using bicycle chains and gears to build it.
But that's spindle.
Huh? No, you could do that on, I mean, I do it on lamps. You turn the thing first, and the router actually traces the shape of the lamp. And because it's tied to cables, as it goes forward, it rotates it very slightly.
Right.
So
It's not a faceplate.
oh, no. Well, the way to do it on face plates, forgotten the guy's name. Met him at the AAW Symposium a few years ago. We talked about different gadgets he sells. He makes a bunch of gadgets that'll mount the router, and you can pivot it. Huh? No. Darn it. He's real famous for making larger, shallow bowls that have cuts all the way through them. He turns a platter and turns a bead on the backside, and then he cuts through the bowl, all of the wood except the bead. And so the bead's actually holding all these fan blades for all practical purposes together. And I can't think of his name now. But he was actually selling little adapters to allow you to swivel it. And also, the guy from Israel is now selling some odds and ends adapters that fit on a lathe and allow it to swivel back and forth or crank it in and cut it. The way I did it is you take a piece of plexiglass. I worked for a Cummings sign company for about a year when I was in college. And the way they molded signs, they took this big, huge sheet of plexiglass, 8 by 10 feet or whatever, and stuck it in a big oven at 300 degrees, pulled it out, and it was like a tarp. And you laid it in this mold, and a big press came down and made it into the shape. What really sucked is when it fell off in the oven, 2 guys had to run in there and pick it up and bring it back out. That was not fun. But you can do this in your home oven on smaller sheets. So what you do is you make a sort of a tentative form, and you can actually do it with a heat gun if you got a lot of patience. You can make it sort of match the form, and then you take one of these bearing or the guides for routers out here that screws into your router, and you make the width, you make it spiral, you cut it out by hand, which is kind of painstaking, and you make it the width of one of those guides. And now all you got to do is set it the right depth away from the piece, and it'll follow that right around. Now it's a little complicated to build, it's a little complicated to hold. So if I was going to do it, I'd make a bunch of those forms the same shape and route them. But you can actually route all the way through the piece when you do that. One of my friends in Nashville did that for a couple of years. He made pieces where he would route curved slots through the pieces using a big plexiglass form like that. But you heat it up to about 300 degrees in the oven for a little while, and it gets real wimpy, and you can lay it right around a form and it'll cool. Or you can take a heat gun and just kind of heat it and bend it and heat it and bend it until you get it right. And with the heat gun, you'll probably get some bubbles in it, but nobody cares because all you care is whether it works or not. But that's the ways that I know to do a spiral with a router. I happen to have one more router crafter to sell. For years, I searched trying to buy, and they were selling for $400 or $500. Now, they sold brand new for $139. So I was bound and determined I was not going to pay more than that for a used one. And I finally found one. I think I paid $129 for it. The very next week, some guy in Cookeville passed away, and his wife was selling all of his woodworking equipment, and he had a router crafter, and I bought it for $40. And it just turns out last week, a friend who had passed away 2 years ago, wife decided she was going to sell all of his work, and I went out there, and she had a router crafter. So I bought it and I sold it to another friend immediately. But they're out there. They're just hard to find. The one Bill Hilton describes in his book is real easy to build. It just uses bicycle gears and chains and a few little metal rods. But anyway, any other questions?
Did yours mean plexiglass or polycarbonate? Plexiglass seems to shatter.
You know, it's a good question. I've used all of it, and I'm not sure what it actually is. I just go buy chunks of clear plexiglass or clear plastic, and I bend it. And I've really hadn't had any troubles with it. I mean, ideally, the polycarbonate would be tougher, from what they say. I haven't had a problem because I'm not forcing it. You know, and I buy it fairly thick. I get it a 1/4 inch thick, so it'll take a lot of support from the router. But also, you can rig up. I used to do. I had to modify a whole bunch of drawer fronts. A lady had bought a desk from the library and was missing a bunch of drawers. And they had these designs carved in them that were like a half a circle. And I figured out one day that it was on about a 4-foot circle. So I made a beam that sat above the lathe 4 feet away, and my router fit on it. And I turned the drawer fronts, and I ran through it, you know, just whatever it needs.
Makes tools that way too.
Yeah. Oh, exactly, making the seats. Yeah, I did a modified Windsor chair seat doing that one time.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.